New York City, late fall, 1997. The man across the table wasn't being cruel. He was just doing his job. He slid a folder toward her, radio format reports, demographic breakdowns, age projections by market segment, and said the thing that nobody in that room was supposed to say out loud. The market wants 18 to 25, Whitney. That's where the money is right now. Whitney Houston was 34 years old. She looked at the folder. She didn't pick it up. What she said next, nobody in that room could quite agree on later. But what she did next, that's the whole story. If you want to stick around for it, hit subscribe and come along. To understand what happened in that Arista Records conference room, you have to understand what music actually looked like in 1997. Not the version we talk about now, draped in nostalgia and soft lighting. The version that was happening week to week, chart by chart, in real time. The Spice Girls had just moved 23 million copies of their debut album in under a year. The Backstreet Boys were everywhere. And somewhere in Louisiana, a 15-year-old named Britney Spears had just signed a record deal that nobody outside of her small town had heard about yet. But the executives knew. They always know first. The entire industry was pivoting hard toward youth. Radio formats were changing. MTV was changing. The money was moving in one direction, and it was moving fast. Whitney had been the voice of her generation since she was 21. 12 years, tens of millions of records, awards stacked so high you'd need a stepladder to count them all. And somehow, in certain rooms in 1997, none of that was quite enough to hold back what was coming. The man across the table had numbers that agreed with him, and Whitney sat there staring at the folder. The thing is, this wasn't the first time she'd been in this position. Not even close. It just looked different every time. In 1989, Whitney performed at the Soul Train Music Awards. She was already the biggest selling female artist in the world by that point. She walked out on that stage and the audience booed her. Booed her. The explanation, if you could call it that, was something she'd been hearing for years already. She was too pop for black radio and too black for pop. The church girl from Newark, who had made music that crossed every line the industry drew, had ended up belonging to nobody's tribe completely. Too smooth for one side, too much for the other. She didn't cry on stage. She finished her performance, but something about that night settled into her and didn't leave. If you grew up going to church with Sissy Houston as your mother, singing in the choir before you could tie your shoes, the gospel wasn't just a genre. It was a language. It was how your family spoke to God, to each other, to the world. And for most of her early career, Whitney had taken that language and poured it into music that the industry decided was appropriate for her. Perfectly arranged, perfectly produced, perfectly controlled. The ballads were flawless. The performances were legendary. The applause was enormous. And something about it had felt for years like singing in a box. She was the voice in the machine. And by 1997, the machine was informing her that the voice had an expiration date. That's the part that tends to get overlooked. By the late 90s, the whisper had turned into something louder, not always in print, but in rooms, in the way conversations shifted when her name came up in certain contexts, in the way the word legacy had started appearing alongside her name, which is the music industry's polite shorthand for past tense. Critics had started writing about her spinning her wheels. One major publication noted that her recent output felt like an artist in maintenance mode rather than a builder. The review wasn't unkind. It was worse than unkind. It was accurate about the wrong thing entirely. She wasn't maintaining. She was caged. There's a version of Whitney Houston the industry had decided on. The ballad queen, the power vocalist, the woman who could level an arena with 3 notes. That version was safe and profitable and made complete sense in a spreadsheet. But it had almost nothing to do with what she'd actually grown up singing. The gospel didn't sound like a polished power ballad. It sounded like someone who had finally run out of polite ways to ask for what they needed. Raw, unruly, unconcerned with radio format windows and quarterly projections. Nobody in her world in 1997 was asking for that version, so they brought in a producer. His name was Dale Ashford. Solid reputation, strong credits, smart enough to understand exactly what the market wanted and translate that into a workable plan for Whitney. The sessions were booked. The musicians were arranged. Everything was in place for the kind of album that made perfect sense on paper. Safe R&B, radio-friendly, warm and palatable, and designed not to unsettle anybody's expectations. Whitney sat in those sessions and listened to what came back through the monitors. She didn't argue. She didn't create a scene. She just listened, and she felt absolutely nothing. Not the good kind of nothing, not the quiet that comes before something opens. Just a hollow, flat nothing. Music that was technically fine. Music that would have been received with respectful nods and filed away in a category marked acceptable and forgotten inside of 2 years. It sounded like a surrender. She walked out of those sessions and didn't go back. That decision, quiet, unannounced, made without press releases or dramatic statements, was one of the most radical things she had ever done. Because it would have been so much easier to stay, to finish the album, to give the industry exactly what it was asking for, and accept the manageable success that came with that. Instead, she went looking for something she hadn't made yet. She didn't know exactly what it was. She just knew what it wasn't. Rodney Jerkins was 20 years old. He was from Pleasantville, New Jersey, and about an hour south of Newark. He'd been producing since he was barely a teenager. He had a particular kind of instinct that was hard to articulate. This ability to hear where a vocal wanted to go before the singer quite knew it themselves. But in late 1997, in the broader music industry, he was still mostly a name people hadn't gotten to yet. Nobody looked at Rodney Jerkins and thought, yes, that is exactly who needs to be in the room with Whitney Houston. Whitney did. The studio they set up in was not the kind of place that gets photographed for magazine spreads. No label presence, no format consultants, just the two of them. Late nights, the music, and hours of trying things until something stopped sounding like trying and started sounding like something true. What happens in sessions like those is hard to describe if you've never been inside the moment. There's a specific point where the scaffolding drops away, where the technique, all of it, the training, the career, the image, the years of being somebody else's idea of something, falls off, and what's left is just the actual person. That's what happened to Whitney in that room. Her voice had always been technically extraordinary, but technical has a ceiling. What came out of those sessions wasn't technical. It was the Newark church girl and the 34-year-old woman and the 1989 booing and the years of hollow applause and every moment she had spent being packaged into something manageable. All of it finally out in the open, not managed, not filtered, just there. Rodney said later that he knew from the very first night, not that it would sell a certain number of units, that it was real. There is a large difference between those two things. Nobody outside that room knew what was being built. The industry was still watching the charts, still measuring the youth wave, still preparing to write off anyone who had peaked before the current cycle. And in that studio, Whitney Houston was recording the most honest music of her life. My Love Is Your Love was released in November 1998. Radio took a moment to figure out what to do with it. This wasn't the Whitney they had formatted for over the past decade. It wasn't inevitable and smooth and easy to place. It had edges. It had hip-hop running underneath it like a current. It sounded like a conversation between the church and the street, which is exactly where Whitney had started, and exactly where the industry had never wanted her to return. It went platinum in the United States, then multi-platinum. It sold over 10 million copies worldwide. The singles didn't ask permission. It's not right, but it's okay. Walked into a room and took it. Heartbreak Hotel did something different and equally undeniable. I Learned from the Best didn't negotiate. These weren't songs designed in a conference room. They were songs built in the dark by two people who weren't in a hurry to be categorized. But the full accounting came at the Grammys, February 2000, the Shrine Auditorium, Los Angeles. Whitney walked in that night carrying something different than she'd carried to award shows before. Not nerves. She'd outgrown those long ago. Something quieter. The particular calm of a person who has already done the hard part in private and is simply waiting for the public record to catch up. She took home the Grammy for Best R&B Album, then Best Female R&B Vocal Performance. The man who had slid that folder across the conference table 2 years earlier was not at that podium with her. He never is. That's not how this particular story ends. The music did the talking, the way it always does when it's real enough. Here's the thing about that Soul Train night in 1989 that doesn't get said enough. She was booed for not belonging, for being too much of one thing and not enough of another, for making music that crossed lines someone had decided should stay where they were. And 9 years later, the album that went everywhere, that pulled hip-hop and gospel and raw R&B together and did it in Whitney's voice, which was the voice that had grown up in the church and been packaged and repackaged until it was almost unrecognizable. That album was the answer. Not the answer to her critics, not the answer to Dale Ashford or the man with the folder, the answer to herself. The industry had a theory about women at 34, about what was left after the commercial peak had passed, about when it was appropriate to start curating a legacy rather than continuing to build one. Whitney picked up none of it. She found a 20-year-old producer from New Jersey that most people hadn't heard of, walked away from the safe sessions without making an announcement to anyone, and made the most honest music of her life. Not at 21, not at 25, at 34. There's a line from an interview Whitney gave around the album's release that didn't make many headlines at the time. She was asked what was different about making this record. She thought about it for a second. Then she said, "I stopped trying to give people what they expected. I started trying to give them what was real." That is the entire story in one sentence. So here's what I want to leave you with. Has there ever been a moment in your own life when everybody in the room had already decided what you were capable of? When the evidence pointed one way, the numbers backed it up, the reasonable people all nodded in agreement, and you chose to believe something completely different anyway? Because that's what this album was. Not a reinvention, not a comeback, a refusal, a quiet, unannounced, deeply personal refusal to accept someone else's ceiling as your own. The folder sat on the table in that conference room in the fall of 1997. Whitney never picked it up. Tell me in the comments, what was your folder? And did you leave it on the table?